She was homeless, forgotten by society, and then one night she received a mysterious invitation that would drag her into the world of Boston's elite and force a powerful man to confront a past he'd tried to erase. That's right, in this story, a woman with nothing walks into a ballroom filled with everything she once lost, and the moment she locks eyes with Charles Whitmore, the air freezes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, your city, your country, or even your favorite chair. Enjoy the story. The letter arrived without a return address, just a single line in careful handwriting. If there's still hope, Sarah Miller found it tucked into the fold of her makeshift shelter near the corner of Tremont Street. The envelope wasn't torn or stained, a quiet detail that struck her. She hadn't been called by name in weeks, hadn't been invited to anything in months. A dance? A ball? The idea felt absurd, almost cruel. Her fingers hesitated, holding the small slip like it might vanish if she blinked. She'd learned not to believe in kindness, but the invitation sat in her coat pocket like a whisper that refused to die, and it followed her like a ghost. A few hours later, at the shelter where she volunteered sometimes for meals, Sarah stood by the coat rack, eyeing the rows of donated clothes. She found a faded but intact dress blue, simple and modest. It wasn't a gown, but it was clean and carried no holes. As she turned to check the fit, one of the volunteers, a soft-spoken man named Miguel, noticed the slight tremor in her hands. He said nothing. He simply took a charcoal gray coat from a nearby chair and held it out. She looked at him, eyes questioning. He only nodded. No grand gestures, no forced words. She took it. That moment, quiet and loaded with a kind of unspoken dignity, planted the first stone in the path she was about to walk. As night fell, Sarah stood outside a historic Boston hotel, its tall windows glowing gold. She didn't belong there. Everything about the place, its marble steps, the tuxedos gliding through the entrance, the chandelier visible, even from the street, was designed to repel women like her. But she stepped inside anyway, the coat over her shoulders, her chin lifted an inch higher than it wanted to go. Her entrance barely registered. One or two guests glanced over, their eyes sweeping her up and down, not hostile, but dismissive, a quiet judgment that she had neither the fabric nor the finesse to truly belong. She kept walking. Inside, the ballroom was humming with restrained opulence. Glasses clinked in practiced rhythm, laughter floated in curated bursts, and perfume mixed with politics. Sarah leaned into the edge of the crowd, her dress catching the light just enough to look intentional. But it wasn't until she saw him, Charles Whitmore, that the night became something else. He stood near a marble column, dressed in midnight, black, his silver hair combed perfectly, eyes scanning the crowd like a bored emperor. When their eyes met, something flickered. Recognition, guilt, fear, Sarah couldn't place it. But Charles didn't smile, he didn't nod, he didn't move, his face locked into stone. She stepped forward, just a little, enough to close the space, but not enough to claim it. He turned, not slowly, not dramatically, just enough to deny her presence entirely. The movement, subtle but unmistakable, broke something inside her more than any insult could have, and the music kept playing, the violin swelling into a melody so tender it hurt. Sarah found herself against the wall, breathing in and out through her nose, steadying herself with the rhythm of the bow. The silence around her, pierced only by laughter she didn't share, became its own kind of scream. Dinner followed, and Sarah found herself seated near the back. The place cards didn't include names she knew. A woman in a gold dress leaned toward her husband and said, just loud enough, "Do you think someone mistook her for a server?" The laugh that followed was controlled, sharp, surgical. Sarah didn't react. She picked up her glass and took a sip of water. Her fingers were steady now, her face unreadable. Charles sat 4 tables ahead, flanked by men in navy suits. He said nothing. No glance back, no intervention. His silence, as heavy as a stone cathedral, said more than any defense could have. When the meal ended, Sarah stood and slipped out onto the terrace. The cold kissed her skin, sharp and honest. She lit a cigarette, watched the smoke coil against the winter air. Her breath was visible. Each puff, each inhale, reminded her of nights spent curled under bus stops, of dreams that had burned out. Long before dawn, tonight she'd stepped into their world, wearing a coat borrowed from kindness and a dress held together by belief. And they'd barely noticed. Still, the fact remained. She had come. They couldn't erase that. There were no dramatic exits, no declarations. Just Sarah standing against a granite ledge, staring out at the harbor lights in the distance, knowing that something irreversible had begun. Not because of what anyone said or did, but because of how she felt, walking back out into the cold. Not victorious, but no longer invisible. And deep inside the ballroom, Charles Whitmore sat unmoving, a glass of brandy untouched before him, haunted not by the woman who appeared uninvited, but by the fact that she had every right to be there. When Sarah stepped back into the ballroom, the air felt heavier than before, as if every chandelier, every golden detail on the crown molding, carried a weight meant to press down on people like her. Her shoes tapped softly on the polished floor, not enough to make heads turn, but enough to remind her that she was there by choice, not by mistake. The moment she re-entered, the ambiance shifted in subtle ways. Glances held a beat longer, conversations lowered, as if afraid of being overheard. There was no grand spectacle, just the slow, pulsing awareness that someone outside the invisible lines had dared to cross them. The violins continued to play, elegant and detached, while servers moved with mechanical grace. Sarah found a quiet corner near the edge of the dance floor, watching as couples twirled, smiled, whispered. Their lives were effortless in ways she couldn't comprehend anymore. She wasn't envious, until they landed once again on Charles. He was speaking with a woman in a crimson gown, his hand lightly on her elbow, his posture casual. But his eyes were distant, scanning without moving, aware of Sarah's presence in a way that betrayed him. He didn't look at her directly, but the tension in his jaw and the way his hand clenched slightly when he paused between words revealed everything. Sarah took a sip of champagne she hadn't asked for, left on a tray by a passing server. She didn't pretend to enjoy it. She just held the glass because that's what people here did, and for a moment she could disappear into the decorum. The woman in crimson leaned in closer to Charles, clearly unaware, perhaps very aware of the silent war unfolding across the room. Then, finally, their eyes met again. It wasn't dramatic, it was cautious, restrained. But this time, Charles didn't turn away. Moved first, approaching with calm steps. She stopped a few feet away. "Charles," she said, her voice even almost soft. He flinched ever so slightly, the name hitting like an old scar touched by accident. "Charles," said. "Nothing." He gave a tight nod, the kind given to an acquaintance you hadn't expected and didn't want to acknowledge in public. Then he turned his back to her again, not in panic, in strategy. He was choosing not to let the past dictate his present tour. At least, that's what he wanted others to believe. The rejection wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. The room felt the vibration of the exchange without needing to hear the words. Sarah didn't linger. She returned to her corner, finished the champagne, and set the glass down on a table with precision. Her heart was pounding, not from humiliation, but from confirmation. This wasn't about mistaken invitations or cruel jokes. Mattered, she had shaken something that Charles thought was long buried. And now, whether he wanted to or not, he had to deal with the tremors. Across the room, whispers started. The woman in crimson asked who Sarah was, and Charles Lydor deflected. But others had seen the man near the bar, the older couple by the fireplace, even the host. People began piecing together a story with their eyes. One woman, striking in emerald silk, approached Sarah with a smile too wide to be genuine. "I don't believe we've met," she said. Sarah replied simply, "No, we haven't." The woman hesitated, then turned away, sensing that this was not a conversation meant for light banter. Hours passed in measured glances and half-hearted laughter. When the final song played, a slow waltz, Charles stood near the exit, his expression unreadable. Over her shoulders, her steps calm but deliberate. Outside, the street was quieter than before, the noise of the city dulled by the contrast of the room she'd just exited. She lit another cigarette, letting the smoke fill her lungs, not for comfort, but for rhythm. The night hadn't broken. Her wit had defined her. In the following days, Boston's upper circles whispered about the mysterious woman at the benefit. Some speculated she was a foreign investor, others thought she was a former flame of Charles. Few believed she'd been homeless just weeks before. But Sarah didn't care. She returned to her routines, such as it was. She had her own, and it was far more dangerous than anything they imagined. Because Sarah wasn't interested in exposure or revenge, she was interested in the truth, and Charles Whitmore had just confirmed that truth still had the power to scare the powerful Dot as she walked down Tremont again past the shelter. Past the same bench she had slept on 2 winters ago, the same city seemed altered. The world hadn't changed, but she had entered it from a different door now. She was no longer outside it, begging to be let in. She had seen the machinery of privilege, and it was far more fragile than it looked. Her presence had cracked something. The next evening, Sarah walked into a quiet diner on Commonwealth Avenue, not to eat, but to be around light and people who asked no questions. The night before hadn't faded, it had crystallized. She kept seeing Charles's face as he turned away, kept hearing that violin as it sliced through the silence of her humiliation. What lingered most wasn't the whispers or the glances, but that single voice from the dinner table, error. The phrase repeated like a curse. Was she invited by mistake? That wasn't just social cruelty. That was calculated dismissal, the kind reserved for people who needed to be made invisible again. Quickly, she stirred the tea she hadn't touched and let the spoon clink against the glass. That sound grounded her. No one in the diner recognized her, which made it easier to hold her dignity in place, but the ache remained not from shame, but from anger. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that burns steadily, warming resolve rather than scorching judgment. Charles hadn't protected her. Not from the comment, not from the eyes, not from the weight of a room that didn't want her there. And while she didn't expect rescue, the silence had confirmed everything she needed to know about who he had become. Outside, snow had begun to fall, light and dry, brushing against the window like memory. Sarah stood, pulled her coat tighter, and walked. Her steps had no destination, just direction. She moved through side streets, past iron fences and shuttered boutiques, the city's glow thinning into a calmer rhythm. And then, unprompted, her feet led her toward a building she hadn't approached in years, the old precinct station where Earl used to work. He wasn't there anymore, but something about that worn brick facade called to her. She hesitated, then crossed the street. The bell above the door of the adjacent barber shop rang as she entered, not to cut her hair, but to ask about Earl. The man inside, white-haired and slow-moving, looked up and smiled. "You're looking for Earl Cassidy," she nodded. He gave her an address in Dorchester, scribbled on a receipt. No questions, no assumptions. That night, back in her makeshift room at the shelter, Sarah unfolded the address again and again. It felt like a rope thrown across a river she'd been circling too long. 2 days later, she knocked on Earl's door. He was older, grayer, slower, but when he opened it, his eyes didn't squint with suspicion. They widened with recognition. "Sarah," he said, voice low, like he was reading a name etched into a memory. She didn't hug him, didn't smile, just handed him an envelope with a single photo inside her. Years ago, crouched beside a man, collapsed on the sidewalk, her coat around him. Charles, his face blurry, his condition obvious. Earl stared at the image a long time before, sitting down in silence. "I remember," he finally said, placing the photo on the table. "That was the winter of the blizzard. I filed the incident report." He didn't ask what she wanted. He knew. Not revenge, not exposure, just confirmation. Just truth. He was unconscious. Hypothermia. No ID. "You flagged me down when no one else would stop." Sarah sat across from him, and for a while, they said nothing more. He didn't offer help, she didn't ask. But the air shifted. Something old and unfinished had found breath again. As Sarah left, he pressed a folded note into her hand. "If you ever need it, there's still a record. I didn't throw everything away when I retired." She walked back into the cold with that weight in her pocket, not heavy, but solid. This wasn't about proving anything to Charles. It was about refusing to let him erase the woman who once saved his life when he had nothing. Long before he became someone others feared or followed, the following week passed slowly. The city caught in a cycle of freezing rain and half-melted snow. Sarah returned to the shelter, helped organize donations, scrubbed floors without being asked. She spoke little, but moved with purpose. People noticed. The volunteer who had once given her the coat offered another small gesture this time. A pair of clean leather gloves, worn but warm. She accepted them with the same quiet nod. Each act built upon the last, a staircase of small dignities. But the undercurrent had shifted. Sarah was no longer walking to survive. She was preparing, not for confrontation, but for something harder: acknowledgement. Charles would be forced to see her, truly, and not as an intruder at a party or a shadow. From the past, he would see the woman who had saved him from death on a bitter sidewalk and then watched him rise to power while she fell through the cracks he stepped over. The story wasn't dramatic, but it had teeth. Not in its volume, but in its truth. And Sarah knew, in every bone of her body, that the city they both lived in had a strange way of closing circles when the time was right. The night after her visit to Earl, Sarah sat in the corner of a near-empty church, staring at the flicker of candles lined beneath the altar. It wasn't a place she often visited, but something about the silence there made it easier to think. She wasn't praying, at least, not in any traditional sense. The Bible in her lap was weathered, with pages warped from years of being handled in rain and cold. She wasn't looking for salvation, only clarity. Her fingers traced the spine before flipping to a page marked long ago. A verse on forgiveness. And courage, it didn't offer comfort, only challenge. Forgiveness wasn't the issue. She wasn't there to release Charles from anything. What she needed now was something harder: movement, action. A reason to take the next step instead of waiting to be seen. As she left the church, the city hummed with Friday night activity. Lights blinked from storefronts, sirens echoed in the distance, and people passed by her without thought. The contrast between those lost in their own distractions and the storm brewing inside her was sharp. She walked until she reached a playground closed for winter, metal swings frozen in stillness. Sarah sat on a bench nearby and let her mind wander back to the beginning, not the ballroom, not the photo, but the years before, when she first met Charles. He hadn't been rich then. He'd been desperate, half drunk, half frozen, lying near a sewer grate in South Boston, and she had pulled him upright, wrapped her coat around him, and flagged down help. He hadn't remembered her then. Maybe he still didn't, but that night had shaped the path of both their lives. Whether he admitted it or not, the next morning, Sarah walked the neighborhoods of Boston with deliberate aim. She watched families coming out of bakeries, couples arguing on stoops, children drawing on sidewalks with chalk. She passed them all, moving like a ghost through the city she once knew intimately. At a corner where graffiti bloomed across a crumbling wall, she paused. There had been a time when this block had meant danger, hunger, survival. Now it felt like memory sharp, but distant. She turned and headed to the small building where she knew Earl kept his private office. He greeted her with 2 mugs of black coffee and wordless understanding. She didn't need to explain why she was there. Earl had already gone through his old case files. He laid them out, one by one: police reports, witness statements, photos. The night Charles collapsed was there in ink and timestamp. The paramedics' records confirmed it. Charles Whitmore, found unconscious, no ID, revived by a bystander. Sarah's name was never officially listed, but Earl had written it in his notes. No glory, just survival. He had scrawled in the margin. Sarah looked at the stack, not for revenge, but to anchor herself. Proof, yes, but more than that, a reminder. She had been more than just a figure from Charles's forgotten past. She had been the turning point in it. And now, with the city poised for another of his public appearances, she sensed the arc coming full circle. The invitation to the new event came through one of Earl's contacts at conference on innovation in urban development. Charles would be speaking, and the crowd would be filled with politicians, executives, and media. Earl didn't offer advice. He only looked at her and said, "They won't expect you again." She nodded, tucked the photo and one of the reports into her coat pocket, and walked out into the cold. That night, Sarah returned to her room and cleaned her shoes, washed her hands with care, combed her hair until the tangles gave way. She put on the same dress, not because it was the best she had, but because it had already faced their judgment and survived. She folded the coat over her arm, this time entering not as a stranger, but as a question none of them could answer. At the venue, she took her place in the back row of the hall, unnoticed, the lights dimmed. Charles took the stage, confident, his voice steady as he spoke of rebuilding communities, giving chances, empowering the vulnerable. And then, mid-sentence, he stopped. His eyes locked on hers. He continued, but his voice tightened. The room didn't notice, but Sarah did, and he knew it. Then, near the end, he deviated from his notes. "Years ago, I nearly died on the street," he said, scanning the crowd. "A woman I didn't know kept me alive. She didn't ask for thanks, and I never properly gave it." Murmurs stirred. "Sometimes," he added, "our stories aren't ours alone." He didn't say her name, but he didn't need to. Sarah remained seated, still as stone. She didn't stand, she didn't wave. The moment passed, heavy with meaning. She left before applause, stepping into the night with her coat folded once more across her arm. Something inside her had shifted, not because of his words, but because of her own resolve. She had chosen to be there, to see him say it aloud. To know he finally remembered, not for show, for truth. And that, for her, was enough for now. 2 days passed before Sarah returned to Earl's office, this time carrying more than questions. She had seen something in Charles's eyes during that speech, not regret, but recognition. He had looked at her and spoken of the past, carefully, indirectly, but it was enough to confirm that he remembered. Still, she knew that words spoken from a stage often served image more than truth. Earl met her with the same calm energy, pushing aside a pile of old files as she sat down. She reached into her coat and placed the photograph between them once again. "He remembers," she said. Earl didn't nod. He didn't speak. He simply reached into a drawer and pulled out an envelope. Inside were 3 documents: a deposition, a closed report from the winter of Charles's incident, and a blurry security photo taken by a gas station camera across the street from where she had found him. The time stamp aligned exactly. In the image, her silhouette crouched beside a collapsed man. No dramatics, no spotlights, just 2 lives intersecting in a forgotten moment. Earl had kept it all quietly, without knowing why. "You might not need this now," he said, "but you will when someone tries to erase what's inconvenient." Sarah folded the papers with care, not to protect herself, but to prepare. Truth had weight, and sometimes it had to be carried until the right moment to drop it came. As she walked back through the city, she noticed small changes. People glanced at her longer, a few more smiles, even a quiet nod from a woman outside. A bookstore. The world hadn't changed, but Charles's public words had stirred something, and it didn't take long for the ripples to reach the wrong ears. That evening, a sleek black car pulled up beside the shelter while Sarah was helping unload supplies. A woman stepped out, tall blonde, power wrapped in silk, Veronica Pierce. Sarah recognized her instantly. Charles's longtime associate, the one who had whispered into his ear the night of the benefit. Veronica smiled, the way snakes do, polite but venomous. "Miss Miller, I believe we need to talk," she said, gesturing to the car inside. The car smelled like leather and money. Veronica spoke softly, but with an edge honed over years of boardrooms and backroom deals. "You've had your moment," she began, "and we commend your persistence. But Charles's reputation is fragile. His future is tied to certain narratives. I'd hate to see this story become uncomfortable for everyone involved." Sarah said nothing. Veronica leaned closer. "We can offer you compensation, quietly. You walk away. This goes away. Dignity preserved on all sides." Sarah's gaze didn't waver. "He almost died on that street," she said. "I didn't ask for anything then. I'm not asking now." Veronica exhaled through her nose, frustrated by the lack of leverage. The car stopped. Sarah stepped out before another word was said. By the time she returned to Earl's office, he was already on the phone. Veronica's threats hadn't been idle. Rumors had begun to spread. Sarah was accused of seeking money, manipulating Charles's past for personal gain. Anonymous articles surfaced online. Photos from the benefit were recirculated with cruel captions. But Earl wasn't surprised. He had already prepared his response. He handed Sarah a folder. "These are press credentials and witness statements. You were vouched for by people who saw you save him. You never asked for attention, but now you're going to get it. Be ready." Sarah didn't flinch. She took the folder and held it like armor. That evening, she visited a small local paper, willing to listen. Not for exposure, but for record. They agreed to publish her story quietly, without sensation, using verified details. And avoiding her name, a piece on quiet heroism, anonymous sacrifice. And as it made its way through the city's media bloodstream, something shifted again. The narrative no longer belonged solely to Charles or Veronica. It was now a matter of public memory, and that meant it couldn't be deleted with a check or a threat that weekend. Sarah returned to the same church where she had once sought clarity. She didn't pray, but she sat in the same pew, Bible closed on her lap. Her life wasn't suddenly safe, but it was no longer invisible. And when the door creaked behind her and footsteps approached, she didn't turn around. She didn't need to. Charles sat beside her without a word. For a while, neither spoke. Then he said quietly, "I remember everything." She nodded. That was all he owed her. She stood, looked him in the eye, and said, "So do I." Then she walked away, leaving him seated in the cold light of the sanctuary, holding the silence like it might shatter in his hands. The building was packed. Rows of suited men and sharply dressed women filled the auditorium, the buzz of conversation humming through the air like static before a storm. Charles Whitmore stood just off stage, flanked by 2 assistants and a communications director barking last-minute advice into his ear. The topic was familiar: urban transformation, revitalization, community investment, but his mind wasn't on the teleprompter or the press in the front row. It was on the woman who sat quietly 3 rows from the back, dressed in the same modest coat and dress, legs crossed, posture unshaken. Sarah Miller had returned, and this time she wasn't a question mark, she was a fact no one could rewrite. Charles stepped onto the stage, the lights catching the silver at his temples, applause rising out of obligation more than enthusiasm. He began with the expected statistics, projections, carefully selected stories about change. The audience nodded, some checked their phones, but as he advanced through the slides, his rhythm slowed. His voice caught once, then steadied. Then, without warning, he closed his prepared speech. "Years ago," he said, breaking script, "I lived a night I've never spoken about. I was dying in the street. No coat, no name, no hope. And someone saved me. She didn't call the press. She didn't demand thanks. She just gave. And I have built everything since on that moment." The room went still. Phones were lifted. Cameras clicked. Murmurs spread like fire. Charles continued, not naming her, but revealing enough. "That act taught me that real transformation doesn't begin with investment portfolios. It begins with dignity, the kind that can't be bought." He stepped back from the microphone. No music played. No moderator took over. The silence swelled into something profound. In the audience, Sarah remained seated, expression unreadable. She didn't stand or wave. She wasn't there for applause. She was there to watch a truth finally spoken into a world that tried so hard to silence it. After the speech, the media frenzy erupted. Reporters scrambled for quotes. Bloggers dissected every line. Speculations filled comment threads. But beneath the surface, the power brokers were unsettled. Veronica Pierce called an emergency meeting. Her hold on the narrative had fractured, and in its place grew something unpredictable: public curiosity. The same executives who once doubted Sarah's presence now hesitated before dismissing her, and that hesitation was dangerous. Veronica knew perception was everything, and Charles's confession had shifted it. She moved quickly, using her influence to spin stories behind closed doors, whispers of manipulation, of strategic timing, of a woman who had set a trap decades in the making. She made calls, floated rumors, reactivated old alliances. Within 48 hours, Sarah found herself the subject of a quiet but aggressive investigation. Not legal, not formal. Invitations vanished. Meetings were canceled. People stepped back without explanation. Earl warned her first. He arrived at her door with a newspaper folded under his arm. A photo of her on the front page with the headline, "Mystery Woman or Master Strategist." He placed it on the table, silent, his face grave. Sarah didn't read the article. She knew its tone before even opening the page. But what caught her eye was smaller, barely a blurb, buried near the bottom. A fundraiser hosted by Veronica, public, opulent, strategic. Sarah knew it wasn't just a celebration. It was a move-a declaration that power still answered to wealth and whispers. She attended without fanfare, arriving alone, unannounced, again wearing the same dress. Eyes turned, this time not in confusion but in recognition laced with fear. Veronica greeted her with a smile, so practiced it cracked at the edges. "Sarah, how?" Unexpected. Sarah simply replied, "I was curious to see what redemption looks like when sold by the glass." The tension was immediate, electric. Conversation halted around them. Veronica led her away from the crowd, behind the curtains of civility. "You're playing a dangerous game," she hissed. "One, you don't have the pieces to win." Sarah pulled the folded photograph from her coat pocket, the same image from Earl's archives. "I'm not playing Veronica, I'm remembering." Veronica's face faltered, just slightly. "This story isn't about Charles anymore," Sarah continued. "It's about truth. You tried to erase it, but people are listening now." She turned, walked back into the crowd, and left. Not with victory, not with vengeance, with presence. That alone had become her power. Later that week, Charles called not his assistant, not a representative, him, its usual Polish. "They won't stop Sarah, not unless you step back." She didn't respond immediately. When she did, it was with quiet resolve. "Then they'll have to get used to the noise. Because I'm not stepping anywhere," she hung up, not with bitterness, with peace. Because for the first time she was no longer surviving the silence, she was breaking it, and the sound it made was undeniable. It was raining the night the first real fracture appeared in Veronica's control. Earl arrived at Sarah's door, soaked through, holding a brown envelope sealed in tape, his face sharper than usual. Without preamble, he dropped the envelope on the table and said, "We found it." Inside were documents, financial trails, email transcripts, and a photo, grainy but clear enough. Veronica, leaning in at a gala months ago, whispering to a city councilman who was later connected to the smear articles against Sarah. Earl had quietly worked with a tech contact from his old precinct days to retrieve them from a hidden drive belonging to a disgraced reporter. "She used public resources, Sarah," he said, voice low. "She fed lies to the press through back channels. The evidence is enough to make her sweat, if not burn." Sarah didn't react with triumph. She simply exhaled. What she held in her hands wasn't revenge. It was a line away to force the city to see the machinery behind the elegance. "Let's be precise," she said. "We don't leak it. We reveal it. With care." Together, they planned a controlled release through a community advocacy group that had earned a reputation for quiet integrity, no scandal headlines, no clickbait drama. Just the facts laid bare. It dropped on a Wednesday, with documents attached for transparency, the tone measured and calm. Within hours, the city buzzed. The fallout was swift. Veronica denied the claims. Of course, she called it character assassination, framed herself as the victim of political envy. But the documents spoke louder. Charles remained silent, a choice that echoed louder than any defense he could have offered. Investors began pulling back from Veronica's urban fund. A local station canceled her appearance. A scheduled roundtable at a university replaced her panel with a community leader. Her power didn't collapse, eroded steadily, humiliatingly, and at the next public event, the final one of the fiscal season, she arrived wearing defiance like perfume, but her eyes darted constantly, scanning. For the next blow, Sarah attended to, this time not alone. Earl walked beside her, holding a small manila folder just in case. The room was tense, more polite than warm. Sarah didn't need to speak. Her presence was the message. She passed Veronica in the hallway outside the main hall. They didn't stop, but their eyes locked. Veronica's mask cracked, her mouth opened slightly, but no words came, and Sarah, unshaken, walked past her like smoke through stone. Inside, as speeches began and glasses clinked, Charles stood again to address a room now divided. He acknowledged the shifts, the challenges, and then he paused. His gaze swept towards Sarah once more. "There are stories we run from," he said, "until someone brave enough walks them back to our doorstep." His tone was not sentimental. It was a quiet concession. After the event, Charles found her outside under the awning, where the rain had started again. "I saw the file," he said. "It's all true." Sarah turned, met his eyes. It always was. Veronica didn't leave the party in disgrace. She exited as she always had, poised, surrounded by assistants. But her posture had changed. Her smile was brittle, her stride rushed. She knew, as did everyone else, that she'd lost control of the narrative. Not through scandal or confrontation, but by a woman she tried to silence, refusing to disappear. And that was the real defeat. Back at her room that night, Sarah didn't celebrate. She folded the coat, placed it carefully on the chair, and sat with her Bible open. She didn't need a prayer. She needed only to breathe in the weight of what she had done, not for recognition, but for truth. And it was done. The system hadn't cheered for her. It had simply made room finally for her name to be spoken without shame. A month later, Boston had settled into the quiet rhythm of late winter, that delicate season where the cold no longer bites as sharply and the sidewalks remember how to dry. Sarah stood on the edge of the harbor, her coat folded neatly over her arm, the same one she had worn to every place where she wasn't supposed to belong. She wasn't working at the shelter that morning. Instead, she had accepted Earl's offer to help him review a new batch of contracts for a housing initiatives, mall apartments meant to give people like she once was a fair place to begin again. It wasn't glamorous, it was numbers and margins, stacks of paperwork and late hours, but it was real. And when she placed her initials in blue ink at the bottom of each page, there was a kind of still pride in it that no stage could replicate. Charles found her there, near the pier where the breeze moved with just enough force to ruffle her hair and the sea smelled clean again. He brought 2 cups of coffee, one in each hand, and stood beside her without asking if he could. She didn't turn, didn't need to. He handed her the cup, and she accepted it, her fingers brushing his only slightly. They sipped without speaking for a long time. The water shifted slowly below them, boats bobbing without urgency, gulls circling high above, as if watching from a distance but uninterested in interrupting. There were no apologies, no acknowledgments of all that had passed. Just the silence of 2 people who now shared a story no one else could fully claim. Charles looked different, not in the obvious ways. His suits still fit, his posture still sharp, but his face carried something softer around the eyes. He glanced at her once, not seeking forgiveness, not expecting warmth, just to see if she was still real. She didn't reassure him, she didn't smile. She simply took another sip and let the moment stretch. Later, as they walked together along the path where the leaves had dried and scattered like old pages, Charles spoke. "You never asked for anything." Sarah nodded. "I had already taken enough from myself." It wasn't bitterness. It was memory spoken with calm finality. He didn't press, he offered a quiet laugh, the kind that held no amusement but some understanding. They walked until the sun began to lower, its light warming the stone and the glass of the city behind them. People passed. No one stopped them. No one stared. They were just 2 figures, moving in rhythm with a world that finally seemed willing to let them do so without judgment. When they reached the bench near the old marina, Sarah sat. He joined her, placing the empty coffee cup beside his. There were children playing in the distance, voices light and wild. A dog barked somewhere behind them, then ran past, chasing a ball thrown too far. Life moved on. Sarah leaned back slightly, eyes half closed. "This," she said, not to him, but to herself, "this is the part people don't write down." He looked at her, not understanding fully, but respecting the space between her words. That was enough. She didn't ask him about the next gala or the next press conference. He didn't ask her if she intended to stay involved. They didn't need to define anything. Their history had already done that for them. When she finally stood to leave, she left the coat on the bench beside him. He looked at it, then at her. She gave him nothing to explain it, only a glance, a kind of farewell, not to him, but to the weight the coat once carried. She walked away, steady, deliberate, lighter, not saved, not reborn, just intact. And that, for her, was everything. Charles remained on the bench long after she disappeared into the fold of the city, his hand resting beside the folded coat, the sun lowering behind him, shadows stretching longer across the stone. He didn't move, not because he was waiting for her return, but because something in him finally understood that she had never needed his validation, only the space to exist without erasure. That evening, as streetlights blinked on and the harbor quieted again, Sarah walked past a mural on a back alley, wall faded, chipped, painted long ago by hands no one remembered. It showed a figure walking forward with no path beneath her, only a sky drawn. In strokes of blue and gray, she paused, then kept walking. And as she disappeared down the street, the city didn't change, but it carried her footsteps now, gently, as if finally learning how to remember without rewriting.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. See you in the next one.